As a Mormon, what are your feelings about SF's tendency to be critical of religion?
Well, it's not just science fiction. All of contemporary literature, except for the subgenre of Christian literature, does the same thing right now. In the last 20 or 30 years, it's been that way. Before that, you just took it for granted that everybody went to church and had a religious life. But nowadays, you almost have to apologize if you have a religious character. Religious characters take two forms in science fiction and outside of it. Either they are cynical liars, duping other people in order to take advantage of them or control them or get rich from them, or they are complete idiots who are following along like sheep, believing any lie that the hypocrite is telling them. My experience of religious people, Mormon and otherwise, is the opposite. That I find that my atheist friends are the ones most easily misled by other kinds of dupes. I mean, other kinds of charlatans. They've easily become dupes of the latest science fictional, I shouldn't say science fiction, the latest scientific fad. And they're no wiser than people who believe in God, no more likely to see through pretense and falsity. But religious people very often have this kind of core security. Even if sometimes I think their religious ideas are wrong, which is actually not just sometimes, it's quite often the case. Nevertheless, there is a safety in dealing with a sincerely, not hypocritically religious person, in that he has or she has a degree of certainty about the world and a degree of stability in their own behavior that makes them more, I don't want to say reliable, because that's not it, more predictable. And predictability is a good thing in a community. It's one of the reasons why I think most communities must have some kind of public religion in order to function. I think political correctness is an attempt to create a new public religion. It unfortunately is one of unusual viciousness in its inquisitorial techniques. It really is harking back to not quite the Spanish Inquisition, but certainly goes right back to totalitarian communism, where if you disagree, you must lose your job. Because that's the first recourse of the politically correct, is get that person fired. They have no right to support their family if they don't agree with me and if they don't behave as I think they should. But it's an attempt at that same kind of religious certainty that this is good and we all know it's good and we must all behave according to this standard. Well, that's what religions do, is they make it so we don't have to keep deciding. It's just decided. We all know that this is good. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. In fact, I think communities that are going to survive have to have it. So in science fiction, my program has been to give at least some characters a religious life, to show reasonable people having religious behavior and having religious faith. But I still find people just assuming, they hear that I'm a Mormon, but they assume that because I write science fiction, I must be a Mormon who no longer really believes. And, certainly is not obedient. And they're wrong. I'm a believing, practicing Mormon. Mormons assume that because I'm a writer, I must not be. I wrote a book called Saints, historical fiction, deals with Mormonism, very, straightforward, historically accurate, but not at all negative toward the church. But I have Mormons who will write me letters saying, oh, I love the way that you portray Joseph Smith. This was the most truthful thing I've ever read about Mormonism. I loved it, made my faith stronger. When did you leave the church? Why would you assume? But they do. They assume that if you're a writer, you must have no faith. And quite the contrary. I find that writers are people usually who are most deeply convinced of their core beliefs.
I find it interesting as a reader of science fiction that I really do enjoy your work, and yet on the other hand, I really do enjoy James Morrow's work.
Well, James Morrow, though, at least treats religion as if it matters. He and I do not see eye to eye on almost anything, but he cares about it. What disturbs me most are the ones who act as if it's just to be scorned. He may scorn particular religious behaviors. In fact, I've been questioned about the deep contradiction in Seventh Son, that here I claim to be a religious person and I have this whole book that makes fun of religious belief, and I go, but it doesn't make fun of my religious belief, does it? They missed that point. But it's misused religious belief that I make fun of. I will say, though, that it's something quite often overlooked. Science fiction is the last genre where you can seriously talk about deep theological and moral issues. You can't discuss them seriously elsewhere because you can't manipulate reality the way that science fiction can. Without saying this is a religious idea, you can manipulate reality so that you work with the soul, for example, and it becomes a science fictional device. You have God, but it turns out to be a computer or a robot, like in Asimov's, the R. Daniel Oliva material in the later Foundation books. Or in the earlier Foundation books, it's Harry Seldon. is God. He's God. He's the person who provides a purpose for everyone else's existence and directs the flow of human events and manipulates them. And Asimov was not able to leave it that he simply predicted. He had to have him set up mechanisms that continued to manipulate and to transform and change. Now, I'm sorry, that's the God role. And Asimov might have spent his life as a confessed atheist, but in fact his fiction reveals a deep hunger to understand the role of God in the lives of human beings. What he rejected was the idea of the Platonic transcendent God. That's what has to be excluded from science fiction. But the God role is there, and so are most of the other, in fact, all of the other deep religious issues are dealt with in science fiction far more deeply, richly, and intelligently than in the overwhelming majority of fiction outside of SF. Which is why when I read something like, I can't remember which book of Harry Crews's it was, but he had a character the character's girlfriend reads science fiction, and she says, the reason I do is it makes me think. And he uses that to scorn her. That's the most deeply dumb thing he'd ever heard anyone say. Well, he just hasn't read the right science fiction. You read Star Trek, you don't have to think. The moral issues are just laid out, pop, 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 there it is, and it's all as clear as if Alan Alda were doing it on MASH, or Phil Donahue was exposing it to you in a talk show. But most science fiction is much more difficult and subtle than that, and the good stuff is deep, and it's the one place in fiction anymore where we can really explore it.